Good evening. If you want to come in and find your seats, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you tonight on behalf of the Marion E. Wade Center. We're so glad that you could be with us. My name is Elaine Hooker, and I'm one of the archival staff here at the Wade. We are pleased to welcome this evening Professor Joe Rigney of Bethlehem College and Seminary in Minneapolis, who will speak this evening on C.S. Lewis on the Christian Life, which is the name of his new book published by Crossway. I have been imagining that C.S. Lewis, a scholar of English literature who often wrote about theology for a general audience, would appreciate Joe's blend of literature and theology in his teaching, in his talk tonight, and in this new book. Lewis and Sayers considered themselves translators of academic and theological ideas for the general reader. And sometimes this put them at odds with those who came from a purely academic or a strictly popular viewpoint. But this blend is often exactly what we need. As one reviewer, Gwen Burrow, wrote of Joe's book for the Gospel Coalition, I was skeptical as I cracked Lewis on the Christian Life. Why would I read several hundred pages about Lewis? Why not just read Lewis? I feared this book would be the tinny echo of a grand cathedral bell. I was quickly surprised. Rigney goes far beyond merely summarizing Lewis. He expounds, explains, extrapolates. He offers plenty of his own invaluable insight. He faithfully mirrors and magnifies Lewis, like the final movement in a sonata. Lewis is the exposition, Rigney the recapitulation, and much of my delight came in hearing the same truth spoken in new words after all. Those new persuasive words are just what we need and what we look forward to hearing tonight. So thank you, Joe, for coming, for being willing to share from your research. The new book will be available for sale tonight in our gift shop at a discounted price after the lecture, along with Joe's previous book, Live Like a Narnian. So after the talk, we'll have a brief time for Q&A, and then Joe will be available to sign copies of his books in our museum near the front desk. So please greet him there in the museum area. And we look forward to hearing what you have to share.
It is a privilege to be here at the Wade Center. I've never been to Wheaton. This is my first time, and so to come to the American Mecca of Lewis and the rest is an honor. And I'm excited that you all came out here on a weekday evening to talk about Lewis. I'm sure that we'll have some conversation later in the evening. As I considered what to do in about 45 minutes on Lewis on the Christian Life, I had a couple of options, and I sent them to some friends and asked for help. One of those options, I'm going to tell you the talks I'm not going to give. I'm going to tell you the talks that I'm not going to give.
It's as high as it'll go.
High as it'll go.
We'll go this way.
Okay. Great. We good now? Oh, there we go. You guys were going to sit in silence for the next 45 minutes. That's right. As I considered what aspects of Lewis on the Christian Life, I sent a couple of options to some friends and said, what do you think? And so I'm going to tell you the talks I'm not going to give. The first would have been on the choice. Everywhere Lewis, and everything Lewis writes, he's confronting us with a fundamental choice. You are here and now, God is here and now, and God is pursuing you, which means that you're faced with a choice. Either put God at the center of your life, or put yourself there. And this choice takes innumerable forms. And so we could have talked about the choice in relation to family love or affection, and the way that when affection or familial love is elevated too highly, it becomes unduly possessive and tyrannous. Or we could have talked about it in relation to friendship, another of the natural loves that Lewis loved and appreciated. It was one of the highest joys of his life was friendship, and yet it can go deeply wrong when it turns into an inner ring. So those are some of the directions we could have gone, the paths that we could have trodden. Of course, we could have talked about Narnia, but instead what I settled on was to talk about the role of the imagination in the Christian life. So here's the basic structure for my talk tonight. What is the imagination and what is it for in relation to the Christian life? How does the imagination go wrong? What are misuses of it? And how does the gospel recover it? So let's begin with some definitions. For Lewis, reason is the faculty of the mind that analyzes, distinguishes, and abstracts. Reason uses logic to make deductions, to draw conclusions, to take things apart so that we can look at the pieces individually. Reason breaks things down into their parts. It looks at the trees, not the forest. Reason isolates, disassembles, deconstructs, and it produces arguments. That's the result of reasoning, is a series of concepts linked together that we then give to others as evidence that we have, in fact, thought about something. Imagination, on the other hand, loves to embrace its object completely, to take it in a single glance, to see it as something harmonious, symmetrical, self-explanatory. Imagination, quote, loves to lose itself in a labyrinth, to surrender to the inextricable. Imagination doesn't lose itself in the trees, it exults in the forest. It looks at a landscape and says, beautiful. And when pressed, what makes it beautiful, imagination can only point. It's not one thing, not merely the colors or the sensations or the smells. It's the whole thing taken in with all of its realness and quiddity that renders that landscape beautiful and calls forth our response. Now, of course, imagination's not only directed at real landscapes, it can also attend to things that aren't real. Imagination, Lewis says, may involve a reshuffling of universals taken from the real world. So, you take a very short Englishman, you give him large hairy feet and a voracious appetite, and you have a hobbit. You put a horn on a horse, and you have a unicorn. Imagination can deal both with what is and with what might be. If reason produces arguments as we think through a subject, imagination produces images as we picture a scene. The city of Carthage, Lucy at Tumnus's house, Ransom on the floating islands of Perelandra. The images we use in our imagination often come and go rapidly. They flit through our mind very fast. And what's left is less any distinct particular image, but more of a quality. Imagination is what gives us the Minnesotaness of Minnesota. Okay? It's cold. It snowed in April. It was like the land that only the White Witch could love. Always winter, never Christmas. It's awful. Imagination is also what gives us the quality of homeliness. When you think about your childhood home and the quality that comes through, it's a series of images that build up that quality through your imagination. Now, Lewis associates reason with intellect and thought, and imagination with the heart, with the emotions. Because reason focuses on the abstract, but imagination on the concrete. Reason distances itself from its object so that it can analyze it. And imagination submits to the whole of the object in order to capture that quality. Now, the danger with reason is that we will murder to dissect, that in trying to take things apart, we kill whatever it is we're studying. The danger with imagination is that we'll get carried away by the emotions that it arouses, that we'll be swept off our feet if reason's hand is no longer on the reins. Now, one final note on definition. Lewis says, one of his more famous quotes on this subject, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. Reason is the organ of truth, imagination the organ of meaning. And that imagination is the prerequisite for evaluating whether something is true or false. Imagination comes first. In other words, before we can know whether something is true or false, you have to know what it means. What are we even talking about? It's imagination that supplies the meaning. And so to see how, I want us to think for a moment about how nature reveals God. So the Bible tells us creation reveals God, right? The heavens declare the glory of God. The sky above proclaims his handiwork. Or Romans chapter 1, God's invisible attributes, his eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So, made things make invisible attributes visible. Created things make the Creator's qualities perceivable. In the rustling grass, I hear him pass. He speaks to me everywhere, right? But how? How does it work? Well, Lewis says that what we get from nature is actually an iconography, a language of images. In other words, a beautiful sunset or an idyllic moment at the lakeside cannot tell us what to believe. Like, they don't tell you what's true or false. To discover what's true or false, you need reason, philosophy, theology. But what the lakeside or the mountain gives to us is a language of images with which we can clothe or incarnate our beliefs. It may not give us truth, but it does give us meaning. So here's what Lewis says. Nature never taught me that there exists a God of glory and of infinite majesty. I had to learn that in other ways. But nature gave the word glory a meaning for me. I still do not know where else I could have found one. I do not see how the fear of God could have ever meant to me anything but the lowest efforts to be safe, if I had never seen certain ominous ravines and unapproachable crags. And if nature had never awakened certain longings in me, huge areas of what I now mean by the love of God would never, so far as I can see, have existed. So nature doesn't tell you whether the statement, God is powerful and glorious, is true. It doesn't verify any theological or philosophical proposition, but nature will help you know what it means. Because we've experienced nature, we've seen a tornado tear across the sky, we've stood at the top of a mountain at sunset, we know what the word powerful means. We know what the word glory means. And so through nature, we gather an experiential knowledge which creates categories in our minds for knowing and loving God, because everything God has made bears some likeness to God. Space, matter, vegetable life, animal life, the fertility of insects, the affection of mammals, the rationality of man. All of these are little windows on what God is like. And so because of this, nature and the imagination that apprehends it can initiate us into the spiritual life. Our experiences can become a stepping stone when we begin to recognize the pattern between the lower world of nature and the higher world of God, between creation and the God who reveals himself in it. So let me illustrate this with Psalm 19. So heavens declare the glory of God. Now, if you ask people how do the heavens reveal the glory of God, I'm willing to bet 9 out of 10 will say they're big. Okay? Their size, their majesty, their grandeur. That's the heavens reveal the glory of God because they're massive, and so is God. It's a little picture of what God is like. Or they might say they're beautiful. Look at the sunset, right? Look at the stars. Got to get outside the city, but look at the stars. And that's true. But in the Psalm, David unpacks his meaning in a slightly different way. Listen to what he says. In them, the heavens, God has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. So the sun is like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man who runs his course with joy. So David looks at the sun as it moves across the sky, and then he looks at a groom on his wedding day, and he sees a connection. That's like that. He looks at the sun again, and he's reminded of a mighty warrior running into battle with spear raised and eyes blazing. So the sun is like the groom, is like the mighty man, and it's this web of images, sun, groom, warrior, that declares the glory of God. It's the web of images that show us how the heavens declare the glory of God. The sun is bright and triumphant. The bridegroom's face is shining as he stands at the aisle, usually bouncing. At least I was bouncing on my wedding day. The warrior is intense but joyful because he's doing what he was built to do. And notice how it's something outside the Bible that helps us to understand the meaning of the Bible. Like if you've never seen the sun move triumphantly across the sky, Psalm 19 doesn't mean anything to you. Like if you've never seen the joy on a bridegroom's face, the psalm doesn't mean anything to you. If you can't imagine a warrior charging into the battle for the joy in it, the psalm doesn't mean anything to you. And if the psalm doesn't mean anything to you, then you won't hear what the heavens are declaring. Now, notice something else about those images, right? All of them in that psalm are masculine images, bridegroom and warrior, which means that not only when we're reading the Psalms, we're looking at the heavens, are we learning about the glory of God, we're learning about masculinity. Masculinity is bright like the sun. It's ecstatic like a groom on his wedding day. It is focused, intense, and deeply joyful like a warrior doing what he was made to do. One pastor defines it, this is what reason would do. Reason would say, masculinity is the glad assumption of sacrificial responsibility. It's a definition. But how do I know what the definition means? I have to go to Psalm 19. I'd have to talk about the sun. I'd have to think about the wedding day, and I'd have to talk about the battle with that warrior with the smile on his face. And then other images would come in, some of them from C.S. Lewis, like, right? King Loon of Archenland. This is what it means to be a king. To be first in every desperate attack. To be last in every desperate retreat. And when there's hunger in the land, as must be now and again in bad years, to wear finer clothes and laugh louder at a scantier meal than any man in your land. What does it mean to be a king? First in, last out, laughing loudest. You begin to think that maybe Loon had been reading a psalm or two. And so this is what our imagination does. My vision of masculinity as I raise two sons, and as I seek to be the man that God has called me to be, is built up out of a series of images. Jimmy Braddock in the movie Cinderella Man, foregoing his own breakfast so that his daughter can have Samoa. My dad dressed for work, waking me up, providing for our family, cheering for me at my baseball game. King Loon with his twinkling eyes and big belly. The sun, the bridegroom, the warriors. These images all build up a concept, a quality. That's what I'm after. That's the kind of man I want to be. Now, I'm doing it for masculinity. We could do the exact same thing with femininity and with a whole host of other things. And all of it will eventually, if we trace it all the way back, if we chase the beams back to the sun, all of them would land on Jesus, right? Because Jesus has a face that's shining like the sun in its full strength. Jesus is a bridegroom who greatly rejoices over his bride. He is a warrior who, for the joy set before him, endured a cross, ran his race, finished his course. All of the images in the end are preaching the glory of Jesus. Now, that's what imagination is and what it does and how it's designed by God to serve our knowledge of him. How does it go wrong? Now, there's a number of different places we could go here. We could talk about the way that Lewis believes that imagination often carries out a blitz on our faith. So there's times where you believe in Christianity, you believe in the gospel, but there's times where all of a sudden it would be very convenient if it weren't in fact true. Right? There's something that you would really want to do, but you know it's not quite right. And so it would be very convenient if you weren't sure that Christianity was true. And at that moment, your imagination, fueled by whatever you want, carries out a blitz on your faith, and all of a sudden there's doubts. I don't know, maybe this, maybe not. But the reasons, the doubts, are actually downstream from the imagination. They're downstream from the ways that, the things that we want, the sinful desires that we want to indulge. We could go there. What I want to do is talk about one of Lewis's best pictures of temptation from his novel Perelandra. Okay, so I want you to think about, hopefully you're familiar with it. If not, I'll try to summarize as much as I can. The unman, which is Weston, possessed by the devil, is tempting the Green Lady, who's the queen of Perelandra. And Perelandra, you'll remember, is a planet filled with seas and floating islands. There is a fixed land, and God's one command to the king and queen of Perelandra is that while they may visit the fixed land, they may not stay there overnight. Okay. So the law of Perelandra is you can visit the fixed land, you may not sleep there. This is the Perelandrian equivalent of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay? Now, the unman, who is a man who has been possessed by the devil, comes and for multiple chapters attempts to convince the Green Lady, this Perelandrian Eve, to stay overnight on the fixed land. And the temptation unfolds through many stages, all of them designed first to corrupt her imagination in order to eventually corrupt her will. And so he begins by introducing her. How would you begin if you were the devil trying to tempt an unfallen woman to do something that God had commanded her not to do? What would you do? The unman begins by introducing her to the concept of stories, of fiction, of poetry. The world, he says, is made up not only of what is, but of what might be. Maleldil, that's the name for Christ in the stories, knows both and wants us to know both. And so stories are good. We tell them for mirth and for wonder and for wisdom. But the unman says, Maleldil's command, don't live on the fixed land, might serve the purpose of story. He's given you that command so that you would have a might be to think about. Imagine what it would be like to live on the fixed land. In addition to introducing stories, he also seeks to detach her from her husband's opinion. They've been separated. Her husband is somewhere else on the planet. And the entire temptation, they're separated. And the unman is encouraging her, think for yourself. Don't rely on the king to make you wiser and older and more mature. Become a full woman, like a woman of earth, who are great of spirit and always reach out their hands for the new and unexpected good and see that it is good long before the men understand it. So this is the first stage of her temptation. Introduce the notion of stories, help her to begin to think of herself independently from her husband, the king, and help her begin to create a desire for the greatness of earthly women. Now, from this foundation, he then encourages her, make a story about living on the fixed land. And she has a hard time doing this. She says, I can imagine a story where the land beasts swim and where the sea beasts fly. I can imagine a story all different kinds of stories. I can't imagine a story of me living on the fixed land and have Maleldil be a part of it. I can't imagine a story where I'm doing disobedience and God's a part of it. And so he tries to help her. He begins to tell her stories. He begins to tell her story after story after story about great women on earth who suffered much at the hands of their fathers, their husbands, their children, and society. And the common thread in each of these stories is that each one of these women had stood forth alone and braved a terrible risk for her child, her lover, or her people. Quote, each had been misunderstood and persecuted. Each had been magnificently vindicated by her decision. And the cumulative effect of the stories as the unman tells her story after story after story is to build up in her mind two images, one in the foreground and one in the background. The dominant image is of the goddess, quote, the tall, slender form, unbowed through the world's weight, though the world's weight is resting on her shoulders, stepping forth fearless and friendless into the dark to do for others what those others will not do for themselves. And then in the background, there's another image, more by unspoken contrast, and it's that of men, quote, a countless multitude of childish, arrogant, timid, and lazy creatures prepared to try nothing, to risk nothing, to make no exertion, and capable of being raised into full life only by the unthanked and rebellious virtue of their females. So he builds up these ideas in her head, drawing her to one and repulsing her from the other. And the result is that she becomes captivated. Ransom, who's there trying to prevent the disaster, the catastrophe, is horrified when he sees her face as she listens to these stories with rapt attention. And a new expression begins to appear, a touch of invited grandeur, of enjoyed pathos, the assumption of a role as she begins to imagine perhaps herself stepping in to the great and tragic deed. In fact, the idea of the great deed, of the great risks, of a kind of martyrdom were presented to her every day. And she begins to wonder, is there some great deed to be done by me for the king and for our children? Must I be the one to sacrifice myself by sleeping on the fixed land? Contrary to the command of the God that I love. And the fascinating thing as Lewis depicts this is that her motives the entire time are still noble. It's entirely noble. Like the dominant motive is she wants to be a risk bearer, a tragic pioneer, but it's rooted in her love for her husband and for their unborn children, and even love for God himself. Because what she's attracted to is the nobility of the self-sacrifice, of the self-dedication. But there is a touch of theatricality, the hint of a self-admiring inclination, a desire to seize for herself a grand role in the drama of her world. And his final step in his temptation is to give her a mirror, so that not only can she have a mental picture, but to have a physical one as well. And as she looks in the mirror, at first she's startled by it. She'd never seen her reflection before, but then she begins to be fascinated by it. And it's not mainly a fascination with her physical beauty, although she is physically beautiful, but it's meant to be, that physical beauty is meant to be a picture of the beauty of her soul, and the unman wants her to become fascinated and enraptured by the beauty of her great soul, so that she would step forth to play the role that he has for her. The effect of this is that Ransom begins to have a harder and harder time drawing her back to reality, to the facts on the ground. The fact is, God said, don't do it. But all she can think about is the role, the drama, the place that she might play. The narrator says, the unman was making her mind a theater in which the phantom self should hold the stage, and he had already written the play. Now, that's temptation, and it's entirely driven by an appeal to the imagination. Now, obviously, there's all kinds of places we could go for that in terms of application to our lives, right? This is exactly the play that the devil ran on Adam and Eve in the garden. Did God really say? What's that? It's a story. Did he really say? Remember with me, is this the world? Did God really say you may not eat from any tree of the garden? That's not what God said. He said you may eat from every tree except one. And the devil takes the one no in the world full of yes and says, it's a world of no, isn't it? Isn't God stingy? Isn't he trying to keep you back and hold you down? No, he said we can eat from every tree. We just can't eat from that one, or we can't even touch it, or we'll die. No, you won't die. Imagine this world, a world where you eat but don't die. Come, live in my fantasy. Come live in the world that I have built for you. And in our case, Eve falls, and her husband joins her. So we could talk about the biblical elements of the appeal to the imagination in Genesis chapter 3. And we could talk about the way that bad stories shape us. Lewis has some great insights here about the way that stories create ruts in our mind. Just as if you have a rut in your path, all the rainwater will run into that rut. And if you wear blue spectacles, everything you see will turn to blue. Well, if you fill your mind with sentimental songs and sexually suggestive images, your resistance to certain types of temptations will be almost non-existent. It'd be like trying to dam up a river with a fistful of gravel. But I want to focus on two other ways that our imagination goes wrong. Have you ever noticed that bitterness, anger, and resentment are all fueled by imagination? Someone's done something to hurt us or to offend us, and for some reason, we play the tape over and over and over in our imagination. In fact, Lewis says that bitterness behaves exactly like a lust. It's the sort of thing that we love to fondle. It's an image that we love to nurse. We love to nurse the past offense in our imagination, and we derive a twisted kind of pleasure in feeling offended. It's an amazing thing. It's strange. We get pleasure in being offended and angry at someone and in working ourselves up again and again, and we work hard to maintain the bitterness. It's like an itch that we can't help but scratch. Or take envy and malice. Envy is fueled by the great offense of other people's success. When we see the blessings and success of others with envious eyes, we churn and stew over them, grumbling things like, that's not fair, and why not me, and I'm as good as you. Other people's gifts and talents and blessings are threats to our joy, and we use our imagination first to picture the blessings and to work up the envy, and then to imagine them losing them in a great catastrophe. We get a sick kind of satisfaction in imagining them being taken down a notch. That's one way that imagination can go wrong at a very practical level. Second, imagination fuels what Lewis calls the all I want state of mind. This is in SCREWTAPE. Most of our daily disappointments and our low-grade unhappiness flow from the all I want state of mind. Like we compare our present life to our past life, or we compare it to our hoped-for future, we compare it to the blessing of our friends, and we live in this sullen irritation and annoyance. And we repeat, all I want, like a mantra. All I want is a house that's a little better, or a little nicer, or has a little more room, or is a little more quiet. All I want is a little respect at work, or a little vacation, or a little appreciation. All I want is a little more of whatever isn't making me happy right now. And in truth, some of those things might actually do us some good, right? A restful vacation might be just the thing that the doctor ordered. Being appreciated for our efforts at home or at work, being respected by family, friends, and coworkers, that could help your soul, but they will only help us if we reject the tyranny of the all I want state of mind. And that all I want state of mind comes from a particular place. In Lewis's mind, it comes for a misunderstanding of the word mine. The peevishness comes from a false sense of ownership that we have about our lives. Because most of us know that life will be hard. We believe hardship's a part of life. But we get angry when hardship comes and it's conceived as injury, like somebody has wronged us. Like hardship's okay, but injury is not. And injury depends on the claims that we make upon our lives. Like if we make claims about our time, or our relationships, or our plans, then when hardship comes in any of those places, we feel something has been stolen from us. That was mine. That was my afternoon that I planned to do this, and you interrupted it. And all I want is one afternoon of peace and quiet. The more injured we feel, the more peevish we become, and the more we find ourselves saying, all I want. And it's not just true of nuisances and inconveniences and hard things. It's actually true of blessings. Okay? This is one of Lewis's great insights. Lewis thinks that part of the Lord's Prayer, when you pray the Lord's Prayer and you say, thy will be done, ought to be a mental preparation for receiving blessings. God, your will be done in terms of your blessings. Now we think, and we rightly think, thy will be done means help me prepare for trials. Your will be done even when it's hard. Lewis says we need your will be done even when it's good. Why? It seems to me, he says, that we often almost sulkily reject the good that God offers us because at that moment we were expecting some other good. God's trying to give you something, but you're too fixated on the thing that you wanted that he's not giving you to receive what he is. One good was expected, another was given, and it's possible, Lewis says, to cling to the old good, and in clinging to the old good, to make the new good insipid to the taste. In that moment, we have a choice. You can cling to the old good, the expected good, and you can ruin the joy that God has sent. You can refuse to let God surprise you with joy. You can cut yourself off from his blessing because of your dissatisfaction at not getting what you wanted. Or you can receive whatever God sends your way, both the good and the hard. You can renounce the all I want state of mind day by day and plunge into the wave that God sends. Now that's how imagination goes wrong. I want to conclude our time, and then we'll have a lot of time, I think, here for some questions and discussion. Here's how can we recover it for the Christian life? What is the role of the imagination in terms of the gospel? It's what Lewis calls good pretending. And he actually says that good pretending sums up the entire Christian life. This is it, the whole ball of wax. Now, there's two different kinds of pretending. Bad pretending is called hypocrisy. It's when we pretend to be something we're not, and the pretense is a substitute for reality. That's bad pretending. It's hypocrisy. Pretending to be something we're not, and the pretense is a substitute for reality. It's fake. Good pretending is when the pretense leads up to the reality. When the pretending is the on-ramp to reality. It's what children do when they pretend to be grown up so they can grow up. And so that's good pretending. What children do when they pretend to be grown up so that they can grow up. Lewis says that's the whole ball of wax when it comes to the Christian life. How? Well, it begins with God pretending. And this may be a strange way. This is Lewis trying to surprise us with basic truth. He says, God sees before him a self-centered, greedy, grumbling, rebellious human animal. But then God says, let us pretend that this isn't a mere creature, but our son. It's like Christ insofar as it's a man, because Christ became man. And let's pretend that it's also like him in spirit. Let's treat this man as if it were in fact what it is not. Let's pretend in order to make the pretense into a reality. Now, that is what theologians call justification. God justifies the ungodly, as Paul says in Romans 4. Because in ourselves, we're not righteous, we're ungodly, we're wicked, we're rebellious. But by the grace of God, through our faith in Jesus, God now treats us, regards us as righteous. He acquits us in his courtroom. Now, this pretending isn't a legal fiction, as Protestants are often accused of making it, because it only works if you're actually trusting in Jesus, who is the righteous one, because he lived for us, he died for us, he was raised for us, and when we trust in him, we're united to him, and because of that, God justifies us. That is, he treats us as though we were as righteous and holy as Jesus is. In other words, God pretends. And the whole point of God pretending is that the pretense would become reality. And that's where our pretending comes in. It begins with God pretending, and then we join in. Lewis connects good pretending to the biblical language of clothing yourself with Christ, or putting on Christ. Like we dress up as Christ as we come into God's presence. When you pray, Our Father who art in heaven, you're pretending to be Jesus. You're dressing up in robes of Jesus in order to enter into the presence of the Father. We dress up like Christ, and in this case, the clothes really do make the man, or remake the man. We call God our Father because we are dressed up in the righteousness of his Son. But it's about more than prayer. It spills over, good pretending spills over into our obedience. And this is where the role of imagination comes in. So, take the two greatest commandments. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Start with those. Now, most of us do not live in a constant state of warm-hearted affection for God or for people, right? I love people, it's right. I love humanity. It's people I can't stand. Our hearts do not always soar in worship, and we find people to be a teensy little bit, big bit difficult, burdensome. And so what do? Here's Lewis's suggestion. Imagine what you would be like if you really did experience a deep spiritual gospel renewal. Like if you really believed that the living God was for you and that he would meet all of your needs and that you didn't need to use people to get what you want because you know that God accepts you and approves you and embraces you, and so you overflow with his kind of love. Imagine if that happened to you. Imagine that version of yourself, the one that's free, that's happy, that's stable, and full of life and love. Now, take that imaginary you and put him or her in the situations that you face in your life today. What would that imaginary, thoroughly gospeled you do tomorrow? Like if you really did love God deeply from the heart, like if it was true that you really did love him with all your heart, soul, what would you do? And if you really did love your neighbor sincerely, not in a mercenary way about what you could do, what I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of thing, but just really pursuing their good. If you really felt that for them, what would you do? And when you have the answer, Lewis says, ask for God's help and then go and do it. even if you suspect that your motives are still mixed. In other words, do the deeds of love even when some of the substance is lacking. Don't wait for your motives to be fully pure. They never will be. Instead, you repent of them. Repent of your impure motives, your sinful preferences, your spiritual apathy. But then look at yourself in the mirror of the gospel. This is the inverse of that, of the lady who's looking in the mirror and falling in love with herself. Look at yourself in the mirror of the gospel. See what you are in light of the good news, and now live into that imaginary vision of yourself in Christ. Persevere in it. Cling to it. Imagine what you would be like. Pray for God's help, and then pretend your way into the reality of what God says about you. Live like an obedient child because God has called you one. This is different. I want you to think about this. This is different than simply what would Jesus do? Okay? Because that question is a good question. It's a biblical question. But the problem is when you're in the situation and it's what would Jesus do, you go, the gap between me and Jesus is so high that I have no idea. So just say, okay, don't ask what would Jesus do. Ask, what would I do if I was full of Jesus? Like me. Like the me with my personality and my giftings and my abilities and all of me, but if I was really full of the love of God, what do I think I would do? Now go do it. And it's also more than just fake it till you make it. Because this kind of good pretending comes from a deep sense of our need for grace. It comes from knowing the high standards of God. He expects you to love him with all your heart, and he expects you to do good for your neighbor, and it comes from knowing that you fail every day. And it comes from knowing that God loves you anyway because of what Jesus has done. And he is for you and wants to make you into a real person, a real human being. Good pretending comes from knowing in your bones that the deepest truth about you is what God says about you and what he's done for you. It knows that you can't just fake it, and that the only way your pretending will become reality is if God shows up and helps you. As Philippians 2:12, right? Work out your salvation with fear and trembling, because it is God who is at work within you to will and to work according to his good pleasure. We work out what God is working in. And we work out our salvation by taking every thought captive, by waging war on ungodly imagination, not letting that tape play over and over and over and over again, by turning away from nursing our grievances and the sinful desires and the all I want state of mind. And we work out our salvation by putting on the Lord Jesus, by clothing ourselves with his life, by imagining our way into our true selves, as we are transformed into his image from one degree of glory to another. Thanks. Do you want me to keep it up here, or what do you want to do?
Let's try turning that one back on and maybe just hold it closer to your
Okay,
mouth.
I can hold it higher.
So thank you so much. I know those were some words that I needed to hear. Are there any questions for Joe?
And you don't have to stick to what I talked about. If you have other questions, go anywhere you want.
There seems to be a fairly large gap that I perceive in between the imagination of a child here, which is the door to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and what he's trying to do, or what has come out in terms of imagining the Christian life, as it were. How does one bridge that gap in terms of Christian warfare? There seems to be something missing in between.
So, let me have that one just so I can make sure we're here. So the gap between the kind of fantastic imagination on the one hand, the Narnia kind of imagination, and then the good pretending kind of imagination, you're saying that seems like it's a pretty different kind of thing. Okay. I think what Lewis is going to say, they're certainly different because one of them is fantastic. It has that quality of unreality. That's what Narnia has. But in the common thread in both is that images of things that are not here are involved. So whether it's fawns and centaurs and white witches, or whether it's the gospel you who actually loves people, neither one of them are here right now. They exist where? As an image in your mind. Okay, the difference is that one of them becomes real insofar as we ask for God's help and try to live into it. Now, the other one actually serves this one. This is what my book, Live Like a Narnian, was all about. It's Christian discipleship in Lewis's Chronicles, because the whole purpose, why do you go through the wardrobe? So that you can learn what it means to be a king and queen in Narnia. And why do you care? Why does it matter what a king or queen in Narnia is like? Because you need to be one here. You need to have that kind of nobility. And the nobility, we need to have nobility and courage and bravery and kindness and chivalry and all of these things. We need to have them made real to us, and they actually become real by being made unreal first. Because that's how they surprise us. We see them there. We see them in their shining glory in Narnia. And we imbibe that quality through those images. And then we bring that image back into our lives here. And then we try to live into it in that good pretending kind of sense. So for me, I'll just give the practical example again of the King Loon. I think that my vision of what fatherhood is built up by 2x4s made out of King Loon. Okay? Because, in other words, and he only appears for like 4 chapters in The Horse and His Boy. But they left a mark. The joy, the strength, the solidity, the stability, the wisdom, the refusal to be provoked. You know, when Rapidash is taunting and everybody else kind of stands up and says, "How dare you?" And he says, "Are you guys going to respond to the taunt of a pageok? Like, do you care what he thinks?" And there's this rebuke of his court, because don't sticks and stones, man. Don't worry about that. Or there's a whole host of things that those scenes in that book have built up as a quality of masculinity that I then carry with me when I come home from work. What am I doing when I come home from work? I've got 2 boys who are going to be waiting there for me, which means I have to get ready. I'm coming from teaching Shakespeare, and I'm going home to baseball and Legos. Okay? So how do I get from Shakespeare to baseball and Legos? And the answer is I have an image in my head of a twinkly-eyed king full of joy, and I dance up the sidewalk.
Are you saying simplistically that the exploration of beyond the door is faith? And as you walk to explore that world, we are looking into a further door of imagination that is explored by C.S. Lewis and he's trying to describe.
I think he would say that the imagination can serve faith, but imagination itself isn't faith. Faith is based on, he wants to say, reason, because you can imagine things that aren't real and aren't true at all, but that faith has a deep rational, it's like that's the way the world is. It makes sense. This is what the argument from reason or the argument from desire or all of the arguments he's doing, the argument from the moral law, this is the way the world really is. Imagination is actually often a threat to that, right? That's when it carries out the blitz. Or it can serve it by clothing it, by giving you concrete. Otherwise, faith or courage are just empty words. And so I need to see courage with clothes on, and it's King Peter running into battle, right? That's how I see what courage is. That's how I know what it means.
I'm wondering if you can also use this imagination with relationship. I think so often of the way Aslan would come to the Narnians and talk to them when they were in situations. And it's not just the imagination of being like the people that you admire, but the imagination of, okay, what do I do now? Okay, let's imagine the relationship. Let's imagine if I was right here with Aslan, or if I was right here with, does it
Yes.
work the same way?
Yes. Oh, hey, there. That one's working now. You got it. Okay. It is. Lewis actually said technology is just magic by another name. That's my summary. But technology and magic are both birthed in the same moment, and one of them works, one of them doesn't. And so chemistry and alchemy are the same. They're cousins. One of them's sick. One of them works. So the question of relationship. So yes, that's right. So I get deeply moved by Shasta walking on the road with Aslan, and Aslan saying, "Tell me your sorrows." Right. So there's a little kid nobody's ever loved him. No, he's been through hardship after hardship after hardship. He's been beaten. Everything he's touched has gone wrong. And he's just like, it's so unfair. Life is just so unfair. And instead of simply saying, "Buck up, kid," right? It's, tell me your sorrows. And what's it doing? It's appealing to your emotions by creating an image that moves you. And it codifies that relationship, because the idea is that Aslan is a lion of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and so is Jesus. And it's meant that concrete picture in Narnia is meant to then fill out your relationship with God, which is why Lewis, when he was asked, a lady wrote him and said, "I'm really concerned that my son is going to love Aslan more than Jesus." And Lewis said, "I wouldn't worry about that, because whatever he loves about Aslan, Jesus has in spades." Right? And so if he learns to love that, he can't help but see it when he turns to the Gospels and sees Jesus look at the Father who says, "I do believe, help my unbelief," after his son has been sick his whole life and his dad's grown. So like that scene of the father with the son who's got demon possessed and has been thrown into the fire his whole life, and the father's like, "Help me." What do I have? Tell me your sorrows. Right? Those two images, one from the Gospels, which is true, real, happened, and one from Narnia, bleed together, and they make me go, I can pray. I can talk to God. I can come into his presence because he wants me, and he wants to talk to me like that.
I was just struck by something that you said about how faith and reason work together, and that when Lewis is arguing for the existence from God, from the idea of natural law or moral order, or from the argument from desire. Now, I would think that the imagination would play a really big role, the fact that we even have imaginations in his argument from desire. So that's a little bit more on the imagination than the reason side to me. So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so the argument from desire does have both, clearly. So the imagination is the experiential thing, right? So I want to find the place where all the joy comes from, right? That's Psyche in Till We Have Faces. I've always, the gray mountain has always appealed to me, and I longed for something, but I don't know what it was, and it awakens this thing, and Lewis obviously had this experience and then communicates it in a variety of ways. And so that's an imagination thing, is that there's something greater that's coming to me through these different experiences that's calling me home. That's imagination. And then what reason does is it takes that fact, that phenomenon, you feel this, and it says, what are the implications of that? Let's see if we can make an argument. And the argument is, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. So if you have that's an argument. That's moved away from imagination, but it's reasoning from the fact that you have this desire and saying, you get hungry, it's because food exists. You experience sexual desire, sex exists. Sexual desire in a sexless world, that would be strange, be weird. But desires don't exist unless they have a fulfillment, which means, this is the cash, therefore, if I discover in myself a desire for something that nothing in this world can satisfy, conclusion, I must begin to think I was made for another world. Right? Satisfaction exists. It's out there. Doesn't mean I'll get it, Lewis says. Maybe I'll starve. People starve in this world. But that there's satisfaction available That's the argument. And so the reason comes in based on the phenomena of that desire and works its way. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions?
I hope this isn't too far afield, but specifically, first of all, I really appreciate everything you said. It's tremendous. It's touching me in all kinds of ways, and I love the Q&A. I love Q&A, but I'm going to just isolate on one thing right now, and it could go far afield. It has nothing literally to do with imagination or reason. I love the whole balance here. It has to do with the scripture verse, Philippians 2:12 and 2:13. I remember my reading a while back that I think it was the first time I saw that verse, and I think Lewis, you might in the corpus, you might realize he used it, and it's a powerful. The two together are a balancing act itself, but it's kind of like a quasi mystery on Calvinism. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God that worketh in you both to will and do him good pleasure. I was wondering if you remembered where I remember that. He's probably done it.
Yeah.
Referred to it more than once,
Yeah.
but it hit me hard
Yep.
30 years ago when I first read it, and it still does.
Yeah.
That verse, and you cited that verse, but if you don't mind,
Yeah.
I hope we're not getting too far.
No, it's fine. It's in Letters to Malcolm. So he does a couple places, but Letters to Malcolm is one of them. And what he says about it is so this is a place actually where I take issue with him, because he wants to say that the verse is actually kind of halfway between Augustinianism, Calvinism, and then what he calls Pelagianism, which Arminianism isn't, but it's on that side. The issue though is that it was Augustine who read the verse and got his theology out of that verse, because he said, underneath my working is God's working. I work. You can't reverse them. We work out what God works in. We work out because God is at work. You don't say it the other way. You don't say God is at work because underneath God's work is me. It doesn't work that way. God's at the bottom. And so that's the sort of statement that Augustinianism or Calvinism absorbs and says, absolutely, our efforts are fueled by divine grace, and divine grace is necessary and underneath all of our efforts. But it's in Letters to Malcolm, and part of the thing though that Lewis does so well is he doesn't allow the work of God to swallow up the necessity of our work, right? So there is a kind of theology that can so exalt God that it overwhelms and drowns out the importance of human effort. So in Paralandra is another great place for this, because when Ransom comes face to face with God, what am I supposed to do? Why am I even here? And the answer is, you need to go punch the unman in the face and strangle him. And Ransom is fighting this. He doesn't want to do this. He thinks this is not spiritual. And the presence is sitting there going, you're only wasting time, right? Which is how God looks at me a lot. You're only wasting time. No, I have reasons. But what Ransom comes to realize in that moment is that everything depends on his choice. Like everything. It all he says, the angels of heaven were silent to see what Elwyn Ransom of Cambridge would do. They're all standing there. What is he going to stand for Maleldill? Will he stand for God and do what seems like the impossible thing, or will he run away? Is he going to make the choice? And everybody's waiting to see, will he make the choice? And then the narrator, Ransom, says, I realized in that moment that gravity rested on every choice. All of them are like that. That at every moment of every day, you're confronted with that choice. Will you stand for Maleldill? Will you stand for Christ? Will you put him at the center? Or will you put something else there? And Lewis's whole point is, over the course of your life, those little choices add up. They turn the choosing part of you into something very different, either into a heavenly creature in harmony with God and with your fellow man and with yourself, or into a hellish creature fit only for misery. And that your choices matter. They really matter. That's in writing the book, I came away. I'm a Calvinist, man. I down the line, all of it. And yet I came away from writing this project going, It's so important to say and to feel the weight of human choices. Everything depends on them. So that's a good place probably.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
You gave us much to think about, yes. You can tell that our hearts are stirred along with our reasons, so thank you and for unpacking all that and sharing from Lewis. As I said, you can greet Joe in the museum area. He'll be signing and greeting you. Crossway is generously offering this new book for 40% off tonight, and Live Like a Narnian is also offered at a discount. So we just thank you so much for coming, and come back again.